Hello and welcome to another episode of Leaders of Transformation. Today we're going to talk about the educational system, what's working about it, what's not working, and what's the future. And we've got a great guest here who is going to talk to us from his experience in owning a college and having an MBA and so forth. So I'm really excited to have with us here today Corey Sigvaldason. Welcome to Leaders of Transformation.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you, Jocelyn Duffy, for the introduction to you and the group. It's a great group, and it's interesting because I recognized a lot of the people before, and it's great to meet some new people. And what you're doing, Nicole, I absolutely love. So thank you for having me on.
Oh, my pleasure. And if those of you who are listening are wondering, what is he talking about, the group? Well, we do have a community on Facebook, which is the Leaders of Transformation, and it's a private group, and we've got some amazing difference makers and world changers, people that are actively out there making an impact that are in the group, and everybody is personally invited or vetted, or we just make sure we've got an active group in there. And if that's something that you'd be interested in, you can find us on Facebook and apply, and then I'll probably get in touch with you, and then we'll have a chat and invite you into the group if it's a good fit. So that's the Leaders of Transformation community. And yes, thank you to Jocelyn. Jocelyn is amazing. She is what I call the message maven. She is an amazing writer and communicator, and I just so appreciate the people that she's introduced us to. So let me tell you a little bit more about Corey. Corey is the president of Grandesco College in Canada, actually, another Canadian, woohoo, in BC. And he's also the CEO of the Hop Performance Institute and the host of Hop Nation podcast. He has a number of designations, and I won't go through all of them, but he does have an MBA, which we are going to talk about, even the MBA program and a special program that he's developed about an alternative to that. And I'm not sure if that's the right word, but we'll get into that later. And he's also an author, a speaker, and an entrepreneur. But really, when we were talking recently and discussing doing this interview, it was the educational system that we were really drilling down into and what's going on there. He's got an insight, an inside scoop on it that I think is really relevant. And it's not something that we've talked about as much on this podcast, is what to do with the educational system. Everybody talks about it being broken, but what do we actually do about it? So with that, Corey, just maybe give us a starting point to build on the current state of the educational system.
Yeah, well, if I may, I need to probably say I'm the least likely person to ever end up in education. And like I told you in our call before, I was actually kicked out of the public school system in grade 4.
Wow.
And
you got to be pretty bad to do that.
Well, I think if you're in grade 4, that's probably an administration and a teacher issue to get kicked out of a school system. There's probably something wrong with this. I was a bit of a troublemaker for sure, but it wasn't unmanageable. But it happened, and I think it was through probably the frustrations that I had, whether it was elementary school, high school, or post-secondary. We all remember those top teachers that we've had in our lives, whether that's in formal school or as mentors or leaders we've had, it might be bosses, coworkers. And then we also remember the other side of it, which is all those negative ones that, could create a pretty damaging effect, in especially early years. And we grow up being told education opens doors, knowledge is power, education is the future. Well, knowledge without application of knowledge is only partial power. It's potential power. You need experience, you need competency, right? And, I think we're moving towards a better system, but the system itself moves very slow, and it's certainly in need of a revamp.
Well, there's a lot of people I know, like, was it Marva Collins and other people that are well known to have attempted to change the system and have not done, they've not been able to do it because the system is so ingrained in its habits. And like you said, it moves really, really slowly. And whether it's the charter schools that are trying to prop up, and I know people who have tried to get charter schools in their area and have failed time and time again because they can't go through the hoops and whatever. What you're talking about, I know a lot because you have a college, is this higher education, even beyond post-secondary. And tell us a little bit about the landscape of what it's looking like right now. There's alternative MBA programs. I kind of alluded to it. You know,
Right.
there's all these changes that are happening. And I think it was you that said the last time, it's like the system is broken, right? And it's actually what you also said. I remember you said it's screwed up learning, right? The educational system itself has screwed up the way we learn. So talk a little bit about that.
Well, we're seeing actually declines for 3 straight years now in full-time MBA programs. And with full-time MBA programs, the average age typically is about 33 years old. So at that age, a lot of people have families and are balancing full-time jobs or other things. So to simply quit their job or give up, a year or two of their life, and all the income, there's the opportunity cost as well as time and balancing other priorities, and when the average MBA, I just posted something on my LinkedIn that I shared, and it said that the average MBA, 2-year MBA costs $60,000. And, some are charging upwards of $120,000 a year. It's a pretty big decision, and it's on the decline, and a lot are getting out of the full-time MBA program. Not only that, it's actually affecting some people getting hired, because if you're taking on a high debt load, and we've seen stats on the amount of loans and that students have coming out of higher ed, the kind of salary that's required to actually survive coming out is putting some companies on a do not hire from list, because of they know the pressures and the salary ask. So what used to be this brand and reputation would land you something could actually be working against them. And
Interesting.
yeah, and the big question really is education worth it?
Is it worth $120,000 a year for what you're going to get in an MBA program? Is it worth it? Lots of people come out of MBA programs, and especially young people that go straight into it, and they're like, I have an MBA. And good. So what does that mean? You have no life experience yet. You got to put some life experience behind it. And I know they do case studies and all that, but it's not the same thing.
Not even close. Not even close. And I mean, I bridge both worlds. Now, Grandesco College and Hot Performance Institute, the majority of what we do is corporate training. So we cater to, the leaders and business owners primarily. That's been, until this year, getting in more into the academic, it's been, upwards of 80% of all the revenues.
Okay.
Right. So, and when I talk with the CEOs or the VPs of HR that are doing hiring, I'm asking them, what are you looking for? And they aren't necessarily looking for certain degrees or anything like that. They're looking for, first and foremost, they'll hire based on character and train for skills a lot of times, because, the type of person, will affect the culture and that, and the great leaders and managers make sure that they, take care of the character side first. And they said, we want competence and a certain, skill sets, not necessarily, credentials, right? And that's a bit of a change, because it used to be, this vetting, but what is happening, I've seen it in terms of students that come to us, in terms of the multiple businesses I've had in hiring. You get someone that has a degree or an education in something, and you make a lot of times a false assumption that they actually know what they went to school to learn. But the problem with education is how it's taught. And it's typically, the teacher or instructor at the front of the room who is giving their knowledge, and someone's listening and then having to memorize and regurgitate for an exam, but they forget it. And even when there is case studies and stuff like that, there's still a disconnect from the actual application of doing it that's personally relevant to the learner. So they gap on the connection point, and they don't ingrain the knowledge that they're gaining. So we've all experienced where we've sat in on a class or did some learning and forgot most of it literally within an hour, right? If we were tested, we wouldn't recall anything, right?
Yep.
So there's ways that we need to practically apply and go to a competency-based learning that's personalized and practically relevant to everyone, so they connect with what they're actually learning. And it's that disconnect that is a real problem.
Yeah, and I guess that really comes back to what is the outcome. The outcome is we want to process this many, we want to graduate this many students, this many MBAs, right? Or is it that we really want these people to get the learning and to empower them with an outcome? And I think that most people who become a teacher or professor, they do that because they want to make an impact. And so it's not that they don't have that intention, but sometimes it gets lost. It's kind of like running a business. You've run lots of businesses, right? You can get in the middle of your business. Your business is about creating impact, creating value in the marketplace, but you get so caught up in the day-to-day operations that sometimes that gets forgotten a little bit. And, we see it here. And one of the things that in some of the stuff I read about your material, you were talking about stakeholders, is even identifying like, who is the stakeholder that we need to be focused on? Because there are several stakeholders as it relates to the educational system. And maybe you can talk about who are the stakeholders and where do we need to focus?
Right. And it's an interesting question because everyone seems to struggle with this because, a lot of the public institutions, they receive some base funding through the government or other sources. And, others rely heavily on alumni and foundation funds and endowments. Others, it's research and grants coming in. And, then you get, labor negotiation disputes and that, and you get management staff and faculty and that all kind of being at odds, and, and students are a pawn. And at the end of the day, the stakeholder that we all need to cater to is the students, because without them, what's the point, first and foremost? And those other things were add-ons that came outside of that. And if we lose sight of that, the fate's going to be that of the same of a dinosaur. You're going to be extinct. Right?
Yeah. So you have a college, and so you've got courses. Maybe talk a little bit about some of the courses that you offer there. And I know you have an M-MBA program. Talk about that. And in that is so practically speaking, how do we fix what's broken? So we can say we need to focus on the students. Okay, so how do we do that? And still have the funding that we need, still have whatever it is that is needed. I think it's good. I mean, we don't necessarily have regulators. We don't really necessarily have some teachers and professors who are going to be listening. But I think it's of interest because a lot of people we've got parents who are paying huge money, and students who are paying for their own bill to go through, college and university. And a lot of people know it's like this system's not working. It doesn't work for a lot of people, right? So there's certain things that are not working about it. Let's put it that way.
Absolutely.
So what do we do about that?
It's a great question, but let me ask this, because there's a lot of listeners to your podcast that actually have their own courses in that. Now, you don't have to be an accredited institution to be a teacher. We're all teachers, every single person. My kids teach me stuff and they're 8 and 10. So everyone's a teacher and everyone's a learner, right? So this whole idea of, the scope of knowledge and learning and education is by accredited institution is being blown away. And I know this sounds crazy for a guy to say that owns a federally designated institution. But you know what? Most of what we know as higher education, be it undergraduate or like MBAs, masters, are a commodity. And the problem with any commodity is then you can't differentiate and compete because it's a commodity. And the only winners, it becomes a race to the bottom, because then it's just a price play. And the only way to differentiate is through some added value or impact and the value of relationships. And I think right now, if we look at where education's headed, how do we all, when we want to learn something, what's the first thing we do? What's the first thing you do if you want to learn something, Nicole?
Google it.
Bingo.
Yeah.
We're hitting the internet.
Yeah.
So we're seeing, all the pillars of education now have actually went, they had their own online platforms and MOOCs, but now you see this huge growth in things like edX, Coursera, and that they all went in on because the internet, we're all doing it, and it brought down the cost. So, the question I ask is, why would I go, to California or Boston to one of the major universities? I don't want to name any names, but there's some pretty big, top 10 business universities I'll pick on here today, that you'd spend, tens of thousands of dollars to take a program, and you can go take the program online with the instructors and get a credential for, a few $100, like 10% of the cost. And it just, and it's diminishing their brand and reputation, I believe, because now people are posting on LinkedIn that they have Harvard or Stanford, Duke, MIT, because they took one 20-hour class. That's, the whole micro learning that a lot of us like to do, because there's certain things that from a skill or competency that we want to learn to bump up. And I think we're seeing more working professionals at least do that. Some people, coming out of high school are going to do the commoditized based because they lack experience. They want to get the education, and the education, even though it's still a commodity, it builds their confidence and it gives them some experience before they go into the real world. The other way, and historically this is how things were actually done, was by apprenticing and having a mentor teach you. And I just had 2 great friends out here. One is a Ph.D. and with one of the largest Canadian public universities, and another is one of the top coaches in California. And we're connecting, and one's completely pro-academic, one's an academic that came from corporate, was with IBM and Hewlett Packard, then went and got MBA, PhD, right? But to learn from both of them and see them both connect, there's been this disconnect between academia and kind of the practice, and that needs to come together, because at the end of the day, the people that are getting educated need to get placed, because we do the corporate training. They're always asking, do you have any students that you can place? And I'm saying not as many as you need, right? And the issue for them is they want to make sure that they're confident and have certain characteristics, and they'll pay for training a lot of times, but we need to relook at it. And you're seeing, things like Seth Godin's alt-MBA come out. We're launching our alt-MBA. And the great thing about education that I found was actually in the network and the people you meet and the friendships. And it was fun. It should be a fun time. And to me, the fun has been zapped out of education, right?
Yeah.
And it's tough to change that
And
because
it's costly. It's costly.
It's very costly.
So there's a lot of pressure on, I've got to make this count. If I'm going to do it, I gotta do well in it. And those are the ones that are taking it seriously. But, and I know not everybody does, parents are paying for it and they're going through college and having a great time, but I'm not talking about that. But one of the things you mentioned, which I wanted to highlight, is you said we're all teachers. And even though somebody may not be necessarily a government regulated educational institute, you're right. We've got e-courses all over the place. Everybody's, creating e-courses and certifications and all of this. And which speaks to the fact that people feel that they need to have these designations. There's a validation there. Okay, I know what to do because I've got this designation, which is not really true. I mean, I've got, people say, what school did you go to? School life experience. That, I've had people say, do you have an MBA? I'm like, well, I earned it on the street, not on the street, what I'm saying, but like life experience. That's how I got my MBA, and so I was never really looking for designations, but that was because I came from an entrepreneurial background. My parents didn't go to university or college, and the people that they hung out with they just owned businesses. And so I was like, okay, so you mean I don't actually need this to do the things that I want to do? Oh, okay. So, but I do need to learn. What do I need to learn? And then I did the micro learning naturally as I was getting into business and realizing I didn't know how to sell. I didn't know how to relate to people, didn't know how to run a business. So
it was an apprenticeship.
Yes. And that's the apprenticeship. And that's how it was. That's how, like you said, that's where we used to do. And we're going back to that.
In the trades.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's this academic approach. And, I've literally trademarked the term pracademic, or it's an application because
that's funny.
It needs to bridge. And, now that I'm doing this PhD, which is, again, crazy to think that I'd be doing this when, I was at risk of being kicked out of high school because they didn't think I'd graduate. And,
Why are you doing a PhD is my question.
It's a good question. When I first started, I thought I would want to continue just teaching and maybe do that tenure track thing. And, the problem right now in academia that I've seen is everyone has this PhD preferred rather than all these practical people. And the best instructors I know when I did the MBA were ones that came from industry and they had, a master's level education, but it was their experience and bringing in guest speakers who had, they wouldn't even say in the bio their education. It was because they were in the field, and learning from that is what, we all value the most, because there's a credibility, there's an integrity, and you're learning and you can resonate and it connects the dots. So that's what I mean when I say pracademic. But the PhD, now the reason I'm going to continue with it is I just want to prove to myself I can do it, because it is challenging. I am in the cohort I'm with. They're, literally award-winning authors and academics, and I'm that 20% in the bottom that make the top 80% possible in the program. But I don't care about marks because no one actually ever asks for your transcript when you're credentialing.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
Well,
And
you want to
because
be around people that are smarter than you, more experienced than you. If you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room, as one of my mentors would say. So, yeah. So,
absolutely. And I like saying that the more I learn, the more I'm finding I have a hell of a lot to learn.
yes, I love one of my favorite quotes, John Wooden, famous coach, and he
Yeah,
says it's what you learn after you know it all that counts. And this is good for me because I think I'm a recovering know-it-all, in the sense that after a while it's kind of like I got to this point where I've seen it all. I've been there, done that. I remember being in my mid to late 20s, and my parents and I'd partnered with them by then, and we had this successful business, and it's doing 8 figures, and we're just like I'm like I got this thing figured out. And then God's like, oh, you don't have squat. Okay, so let me tell you, right? You have no idea what's around the corner. And not to say that he was sabotaging, but that business ended up falling apart, and I got humbled by that experience, not because it was strictly our fault or anything like that, but it was, you just never know. Right. And so the assumption that you think certain things are going to be a certain way, or that you figured it all out, but life is going to throw you curveballs, and it has proven to throw me curveballs many times. And so I've gotten to this point where it's like, I've learned to roll with it. And so that's why I say, from recovering know-it-all, to say, it's what you learn after you know it all that counts, I think is really important. So
absolutely. And, that resilience that we all learn by going through challenging obstacles.
yeah.
And, when we start getting too high on the horse and thinking we've arrived,
It's the pride
God,
before the fall.
universe, absolutely, there's a humbling moment coming around the corner, because none of us get to any level of success completely on our own. Doesn't happen. And I think it can be easy in times where I've probably fallen and, stepped in it the most, is when, forget that, or maybe not acknowledge that as much as I need to.
Yeah, I think we all can lean towards that pride, or I did it. I got here on my own, and that's the ego talking. But let's talk about HOP.
Sure.
What does that stand for? And how do you mentioned about working with organizations, you do training and so forth. Talk a little bit more about what you're doing there, and even for our listeners, like, okay, so what are some takeaways that they can apply going forward?
Right. So HOP is from my PhD research. I've developed something called the HOP model of high performance. And it's based off of Gary Latham and Ed Locke's high performance cycle of goal setting. That's how it started. And I looked at it and I thought to myself, when I looked at the model, I said that there's stuff missing. Like, yes, specific difficult goals with feedback lead to performance, but it's not actually the goals. It's not that's not actually doing it. There's actually other drivers. So I wanted to know, what are the drivers? And the big question I've had, and it was somewhere around age between 10 and 12. I wish I, could remember that eureka moment, but I remember having this burning question of wanting to be better. And, can someone from average circumstance and average means achieve world-class elite level success? And the quick answer is yes. And then the question comes, well, then why do the majority of people not achieve the levels of success that, we want or desire? And to me, I believe it comes down to two simple things: give up too quick and too easily. Right? A lot
Yep,
of times
that.
someone stays in the game just that little bit longer than the other person who gave up too quick. And all of a sudden it just hockey sticks up, and there's the Canadian in me saying hockey stick. And the other
extra
is,
mile.
yeah. And when things get challenging or we hit obstacles, people say, oh, well, I'm just not good enough. And I think the education system, and even as parents, I think even with love and maybe great intent, we can damage and hurt people's potential. We squash creativity and potential. And with goals, for instance, we'll tell people, oh, don't set your sights so high. You don't want to get disappointed. And that's a real crappy thing to say. Go, how do you know?
So they're automatically putting a ceiling, and usually we putting that lid on it. It's funny that you say that, because in the business that I had with my parents, and we would do these presentations and opportunity meetings and so forth, and sometimes because we would talk about from the financial aspect of it, people are like, oh, you're being materialistic. And it was so funny because I heard this guy say this one time, and I think this is so true. He said, where materialism begins? Like, where you become materialistic? It's usually just beyond what they think is a reasonable amount. Like, so if somebody's making 120,000, okay, so you're making, 150, 200 or whatever. That's pretty cool. Okay, so now you're making 2.5 million. Now you're materialist, you know what I mean? Or you're shooting to be a multimillionaire or whatever. It's like, now you're materialistic. It's usually just beyond their own comfort zone. And we do it naturally, not because we mean to do that, but oftentimes parents or adults, we do that with the next generation, and we put that ceiling. We see that a lot with the millennials, right? Those bloody millennials. What do we do with those people? You know what? They actually have a huge value.
Hire them.
Hire them. Yeah, exactly. They're asking some really good questions, that it's funny. People are asking and waiting to, until 50 to ask those questions that they're smart enough to ask at 20. So yeah, pay attention to them. And they learn so fast, they adapt, and there's so many, advantages. Everything has positive and negative. You got to deal with it, not negative, but
they know technology.
Yeah.
Right. They're resilient. They aren't jaded and all worried. They are very creative, their ideas and that, because they'll come at it from a different way. They haven't been tunnel visioned, and they don't have the bias and baggage that comes with it. So,
and their world is so different. I mean, they grew up with a cell phone and an iPad and a whatever. And the first time I worked on a computer and learned, it was a Commodore 64 in high school.
I remember Commodore 64.
And I'm like, what am I supposed to do with this thing? Oh, well, here's the punch card and here's how it works. I'm like, what am I going to do with this? And I got this flashing black screen, or greeny black screen, with a little one, the cursor flashing and nothing. I'm like, and now you've so much talk about, what do? We Google. They can Google, they can YouTube. Yeah.
You can do podcasts.
That's a whole, totally. They can do all those things. And it's that's a whole other subject about the millennials. But, you're right. We put this ceiling on it, and we need to start lifting that lid off of ourselves first, and then off the people that we are mentoring and that are coming up behind us. So, yeah. So coming back to, why you said we started off there talking about, why HOP, and why not everyone is achieving that high performance that they're looking for.
Yeah. So, and I looked at it, and doing a lot of corporate training and dealing with, leaders, and that, finding, this lack of motivation to the corporate goals or team goals in sports, like some of the studies we did with varsity sports. What are some of the drivers, and what are the things that will give that intrinsic motivation in a organizational or a team setting? And, there's a few things, between the goals and the performance that I believe are drivers. And those are the level of team cohesion or the corporate culture. So how cohesive the team is. And the other is, and that's at the group level, and then our individual level of well-being. So our psychological well-being, and there are things like hope, efficacy, or, self-belief and confidence, resiliency or grit, and level of optimism or positivity, things like that. And then, but even before the goal though, because we've all probably, if you're over the age of 25, you've been in a situation where you had a goal or an objective, that your gut didn't feel good. You couldn't get on board with it. And we know that the subconscious or our unconscious really drives most of our attitudes, beliefs, and ultimately our behaviors. And most goal setting and performance management has been really at this logical and front brain thinking. So HOP actually stands for higher order performance. And higher order is really that subconscious level of processing that's done, and kind of the mindset and mental mastery, but also those foundational beliefs, values, principles, and our underlying purpose and calling we all have in our lives that, some people struggle their entire life to find what they're meant to do and their contribution in the world. And one thing we do in all our programs, the first course is literally 3 to 5 days where it's this implicit career search and helping people connect to what's their ultimate essence and contribution to the world. And things like Joseph Campbell talked about the hero's journey, and how, historically people left the community at, adolescence basically, and had to leave the community and go find themselves, whether it's a vision quest or going and, finding their way, and then they would come back and know that this was their contribution. And throughout evolution, industrialization, we've lost a bit of that. And I think really figuring that out gives an underlying motivation. And you may be here and ultimately be wanting to go over there, but like knowing the path and at least knowing what that purpose, Simon Sinek talks about the why. There's lots of people out there that talk about that. We need to know that. And also, what are some of those positive beliefs, principles, values, attitudes we have? And then what are some of those limited ones? And a lot of that subconscious stuff, the research shows, a lot of those neural connections are formed between 0 and age 7. The most rapid growth in terms of creating neural connections is during those years. And then, it slows down till about, it still goes up dramatically till about age 13. And then it starts to really level out, and it becomes really, there's minor growth that can happen, but a lot of it's just recreating neural connections. And that's like changing habits. And, then we get into the topic on change and, people's reluctance to change. So and when you figure out what that is, and then tie the intrinsic motivation, and the intrinsic motivation for people to group goals and a group cause is really the learning and the personal growth and development and appreciation. Daniel Pink in his TED Talk and his book Drive talked about, the two biggest motivators for most people is growth, the opportunity for growth, which is growth in learning, not, in a lot of other areas that we think, and appreciation. And when I go in and work with a lot of corporations, and I look at their performance management system, it's really a corrective discipline. It's, they're dealing with the people who, choose to be meatheads, the 5-10% of people who are being bad, and they're trying to correct that. And they aren't focusing on the 95% of the people that, if they work with them in an equal percentage and kept raising the bar, you'll drag the other people up, or they will release themselves because they won't get on board.
Yeah, it's the focusing on the weak points or focusing on the weaknesses versus building strengths. Now, Dan Sullivan from the Strategic Coach, he talks about if all you do is spend the rest of your life building up your weaknesses, at the end of your life, you're going to end up with a whole lot of strong weaknesses. And
Yeah.
what he was basically saying, he's a big believer in the unique ability. Find your unique ability, focus on that. Most people spend
Yeah.
80% of their time on the things that they're not strong on, only 20% of the time at most on the things that they're really a genius, like genius level stuff. And he's
Yeah.
like, you got to flip that around and, you know, and spend your time doing the things that you're great at. Now, we're not talking about some of these skill sets like what you're talking about. Everybody needs to learn that, like in terms of resilience and
Oh,
resilience.
absolutely.
We're not talking about those things. We're talking about, you know, being good at specific skills or occupational things that, you know, it's like, look, I don't need to be an expert at everything. I'm here to make this particular contribution to the team, and somebody else is going to bring the contribution, somebody else is going to bring the contribution, and do it that way. But yeah, it also reminds me of Jack Welch, where he's, you know, he likes to say, you know, he informs the bottom 10% that they are the bottom 10%,
Mhm.
and that this is what happens to the bottom 10% if you don't move up. And so it's a way of helping them to do that. So for our listeners, what would you recommend if they are in a place where they're saying, you know what, we've talked about education. So, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of educators out there. And I think it's very helpful to know where the industry is, where it's going, so they can pivot if they need to and or adapt to it. Kids looking at, you know, or parents with children looking at where the school system's going and other options rather than this is what everybody does, so just do this, and actually open up those possibilities, much more inexpensive possibilities of how their kids can get educated and don't be shocked. Although I don't think most of our listeners are going to be shocked because they're very entrepreneurial. If their kids decide that they don't want to go to university or college or something. My economics teacher told me that I was completely crazy to open a business instead of going to university. He told me that was a waste of my brains, which I thought was really interesting. But economics teacher, I can get that from my English teacher, you know, but my economics teacher telling me that it's a waste of my brains to have a business. Like, okay. Um, so, you know, so whether it's parents or whatever, but I really want them to be able to take away from even what you're talking about here in terms of improving your own performance. What can they do that
But
can move them? What's that step that they can take right now?
yeah, I think the best thing is to look at where they ultimately want to go. Like, what's the end goal? Don't just go to school or think you need to do something just for the sake of doing it because you were made to go 13 years to school and that's just what you do and it's familiar. So think about what end goal is. Like, what's the purpose of pursuing, you know, education, and, you know, what are you actually passionate about? You know, where are your interests? What are your passions? Because it's a lot of work. It's not going to be easy, and it's dramatically different post-secondary from high school and other schools. So if they're choosing education, um, you know, think through what kind of the end goal is, and then look at, okay, when it's done, talk to people who are in the field, that when they figure out what they want to do, you know, search out mentors, like find out what worked, what didn't, what's valued, what's changing, what they recommend. Like, if you can learn from someone else's mistake who's laid the path in front of you, like, stand on the shoulder of giants, right? You know, there's so many mentors in that I value way more than any teacher I've ever had, you know, that have, you know, there's one or two teachers that had profound impact. But honestly, I think if any of us sat and thought, we could name, you know, the number of teachers on one hand that made a real big impact in our lives. And typically it's one or two when I talk with people. So just realize it is what it is. And look at alternatives. And I don't think jumping right from school to school is a great thing. I think there should be a break, take some time, have some fun. It's that time in your life before, the pressures to start settling down, getting your career, family, all these other things that there's societal pressure at certain ages and that to do things. Just enjoy the journey and really think it through. Don't do it just because it's familiar, and look at alternatives, right? Look at entrepreneurship, and what does it matter if you start something and it doesn't work? Just learn from it. It's all learning, whether we're successful or we fail, right? You don't want to sit back on your laurels, and then failure is never final, and neither is success, because the minute you've, won a gold medal or achieved, your first $10 million in business, it doesn't matter if you can't keep doing something and contributing something of value. And you need to be happy and healthy. At the end of the day, whatever anyone decides to do, make sure you're happy and healthy. Don't just do it because someone told you that's what you should do.
Well, that's awesome. Well, I'd love, before we finish, for you to talk about something we haven't talked that much about, which is peer mentoring, learning from your peers, being in that environment where you get that advice from peers. Can you talk a little bit about that before we wrap up?
Absolutely. Mentorship comes in a lot of forms, and I think when it comes to learning, we can learn a lot from peers, and there's a fun factor in network. If we think of going through school, a lot of it was, building those relationships and learning from others and making those connections. And in business, we know that networks are a critical piece. So we focus really big time on, the peer mentorship model in our training, as well as, the concept of mastermind. Napoleon Hill made pretty familiar in Think and Grow Rich. So definitely, if you aren't already connected to a peer advisory or mastermind group, definitely recommend it.
Perfect. Corey, thank you so much for sharing from your experience. And like the guy who was the most unlikely, I love that, was the most unlikely to be the president of a college and now go on to your Ph.D., having been thrown out of grade 4. You bad little kid you must have been. No, I'm just kidding. But here you are.
Bad.
What's that?
I was pretty bad. I got kicked out an average of 2.5 times a year between grade 4 and grade 12.
Wow. Well,
Yeah,
that gives some hope right there. If that's all, that in itself, I'm sure, has given some hope to some people listening. It's funny because a lot of the most successful people in the entrepreneurial space were not ones that learned through the educational system, were not as successful, or didn't like that environment because they thought outside the box, which is the very thing that helped them when they went out on their own as an entrepreneurs, to think outside the box and to lead the charge, be thought leaders and leaders of transformation, which is what we're talking about here today. So let's give our listeners some ways, and viewers some ways, to connect with you. So you have hopperformanceinstitute.com, grandescocollege.com, and of course you're on LinkedIn, and we'll make sure all those links are in the show notes on the leadersoftransformation.com, so nobody has to worry about trying to spell your last name and find you. We'll make sure that links to you and to your website, both websites, will be on the Leaders of Transformation in the show notes. All you got to do, if you're listening and you're like, how do I find those show notes? Type in Corey in the search field, and it'll bring up this episode. So Corey, again, thank you so much for being here and shedding some light into the educational system and what we can do to better ourselves and educate ourselves, really, really learn what it means to really learn and grow.
And just embrace learning. Don't get caught up on the achievement all the time, because achievement comes and goes. And, I think the path to it is as important as, the actual, arriving wherever that is.
Success is a journey. Absolutely.
Definitely.
So for our listeners and yes, it's a pleasure having you here, Corey. And for our listeners and viewers, I encourage you, leaders of transformation, take action. Take action on something that you heard today, whether that is as you're a parent thinking about your child, planning for their education, thinking outside the box for your own education, getting into a peer mentoring environment where you can learn from others, and developing some of these skills that Corey was talking about that really make the difference for that higher, that higher performance. And what does it take? You talked about the gap between, people that give up too easy and quit versus the resilience and all of that. So I encourage you to take action on something that you learned today. We'd love to hear your stories. You can find us on social media, and which is leadersoftransformation.com. Twitter, it's Leaders Podcast. And of course, on our website, leadersoftransformation.com. And we look forward to hearing from you, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode of Leaders of Transformation real soon.